The snow fell like a funeral shroud across the Ardennes forest on December 16, 1944, masking the thunder of 250,000 German soldiers preparing for what Adolf Hitler called his last roll of the dice. In the pre-dawn darkness, the forest that had witnessed Caesar's legions and Napoleon's retreats would soon echo with the desperate cry of the Third Reich's final offensive. Lieutenant Colonel Jochen Piper adjusted his field glasses, peering through the thick pine branches at the American positions beyond. The 29-year-old commander of Kampfgruppe Piper, the spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, felt the weight of history pressing down upon his shoulders, like the accumulated snow on the forest canopy. Behind him, 117 tanks and assault guns waited in the darkness, their engines silent, their crews tense with anticipation. Hitler's plan, codenamed Operation Watch on the Rhine, was audacious to the point of madness. The Führer envisioned his armies smashing through the weakly held American lines in the Ardennes, racing northwest to capture the vital port of Antwerp, and splitting the Allied forces in two. If successful, it might force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace, allowing Germany to concentrate its remaining strength against the advancing Soviets in the east. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the aging architect of Germany's early victories, had tried to temper Hitler's grandiose ambitions. The veteran commander knew that Germany's reserves were scraped bare, her fuel tanks nearly empty, and her air force a shadow of its former might. Yet Hitler, locked in his East Prussian bunker, remained convinced that one decisive blow could still turn the tide of war. The German preparations had been masterful in their deception. Radio silence blanketed the front, while dummy positions and false radio traffic convinced Allied intelligence that the Germans were merely reinforcing their defensive positions. The real assault force assembled under cover of the Reich's last operational reserves. 3 armies totaling 28 divisions, including elite Waffen-SS units and the cream of Germany's remaining panzer forces, according to military historian Hugh Cole's official U.S. Army history. The Ardennes Battle of the Bulge. The German deception was so complete that American intelligence estimated no more than a single German division faced the 8th Corps' front across no man's land. American Gs huddled in their foxholes, most believing they were in a quiet sector, where green divisions could gain experience and battle-weary units could rest. The 106th Infantry Division, fresh from training camps in the United States, had been in the line for only 5 days. The 28th Infantry Division, decimated in the Hürtgen Forest, was attempting to rebuild its shattered ranks. Few suspected that they stood directly in the path of Hitler's last great gamble. At precisely 5:30 in the morning, the forest erupted in a symphony of destruction. 1,600 German artillery pieces, carefully husbanded for this moment, unleashed their fury upon the American positions. The barrage, lasting 90 minutes, shattered the winter's silence and announced to the world that the Wehrmacht still possessed fangs. As the guns fell silent, the gray-clad infantry emerged from the tree line like phantoms, beginning the battle that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's final attempt to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, the German assault, struck the American lines with the fury of a winter storm, shattering the quiet that had settled over the Ardennes like glass under a hammer. Within hours of the initial bombardment, Kampfgruppe Piper had punched through the defenses of the 99th Infantry Division, their Panther tanks grinding through snow-covered villages that had known peace since 19-40. Captain Charles MacDonald of the 2nd Infantry Division watched in horror as German infantry, supported by massive Tiger tanks, overwhelmed his company's positions near Krinkeld. The Americans, caught completely off guard, fought with desperate courage, but many units simply disintegrated under the weight of the surprise attack. Communications broke down, supply lines were severed, and chaos reigned across a front that stretched 60 miles through the dense Ardennes forest. The most shocking collapse came in the Schnee Eifel, where 2 regiments of the inexperienced 106th Infantry Division found themselves completely surrounded within 48 hours. Over 8,000 American soldiers, including Colonel Charles Cavender and Colonel George Deschanel, faced an impossible choice: fight to the death or surrender. On December 19th, in one of the largest capitulations of American forces in the European theater, both regiments laid down their arms. Piper's armored spearhead, meanwhile, carved a path of destruction deeper into American territory, racing along secondary roads with his characteristic ruthlessness. The SS officer pushed his men and machines to their limits, Fuel was critically short. His tanks were running on captured American gasoline, but momentum was everything. Each hour of delay allowed the Americans to organize their defenses and bring up reinforcements. The advance was marked by tragedy and war crimes that would haunt both sides for decades. Near the village of Malmedy, elements of Piper's command encountered American prisoners from the 785th Field Artillery Battalion. What happened next remains one of the war's most controversial incidents. 84 American prisoners of war were gunned down in a snowy field, their bodies left frozen in the December cold. The Malmedy Massacre, as it became known, would steel American resolve and eliminate any possibility of mercy for SS units. Word of the atrocity spread through American ranks like wildfire, transforming what might have been a tactical withdrawal into a grimly determined defense. Soldiers who might have surrendered when surrounded instead chose to fight to the death. The massacre had given the Americans something more valuable than tanks or artillery. Righteous fury, military historian John Eisenhower, son of the Supreme Allied Commander, later wrote in The Bitter Woods that the Malmedy Massacre fundamentally changed the character of the battle, transforming it from a military operation into a moral crusade. Despite the war crimes, German forces continued their advance. The 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General Hasse von Manteuffel, achieved even greater success than Piper's more dramatic thrust. Von Manteufel's forces crossed the Our River and began the drive toward the Meuse, capturing the key road junction of Clairvaux and threatening to unhinge the entire American defense. In Luxembourg City, General Omar Bradley watched the red pins multiply across his situation map, each one representing a German breakthrough. The usually unflappable commander realized that this was no mere spoiling attack or limited offensive. Hitler had committed his strategic reserve to what German propaganda was already calling the Great Blow in the West. The question now was whether the Allied forces could contain the breakthrough before it reached critical objectives like Antwerp, or whether the Third Reich might yet achieve the miracle its leadership so desperately needed. As German spearheads drove deeper into American territory, one small Belgian town emerged as the fulcrum upon which the entire battle would turn. Bastogne, a sleepy market town of 4,000 inhabitants, sat astride 7 major roads that crisscrossed the Ardennes like the spokes of a wheel. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the movement of armies through the region's difficult terrain. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, received orders on December 18th to rush his paratroopers to Bastogne's defense. The Screaming Eagles, still recovering from their brutal campaign in Holland during Operation Market Garden, had barely 48 hours to prepare before German forces reached the town's outskirts. McAuliffe's 11,000 men faced overwhelming odds, but they possessed something their enemies lacked: absolute confidence in their ability to hold any position they were ordered to defend. The German plan called for the 5th Panzer Army to bypass Bastogne if possible, leaving its capture to following infantry divisions. But as Panzer-Lehr Division and elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division approached the town, they found their advance roads clogged with American convoys rushing reinforcements forward. What was meant to be a quick seizure became a grinding battle for every crossroads and farm. General von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, faced a cruel dilemma. His panzers could not advance without clearing the roads through Bastogne, yet every hour spent reducing the American stronghold was an hour lost in the race to reach the Meuse River. Fuel supplies, already critically short, dwindled with each passing day. The German commander ordered a full siege, hoping to starve the Americans into submission while his mobile forces continued their advance. The weather, which had initially favored the German offensive by grounding Allied aircraft, now turned against both sides. Temperatures plummeted to 10 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, freezing weapons, vehicles, and men with equal ruthlessness. American soldiers, many still wearing summer-weight uniforms, suffered from frostbite and trench foot. Medical supplies ran short, and the wounded often froze to death before they could receive treatment. Inside Bastogne's perimeter, McAuliffe's paratroopers dug foxholes in the frozen ground and prepared for siege warfare. The town's medieval walls had long since crumbled, but the Americans created new fortifications from rubble, abandoned vehicles, and sheer determination. Artillery rounds fell like deadly hail, but the paratroopers held their positions with the stubborn pride of elite troops who had never known defeat. According to SLA Marshall's official army history, Bastogne, the first 8 days, the encircled garrison faced not only German attacks, but also the psychological pressure of complete isolation. With no communication with higher headquarters for critical periods, on December 22nd, German officers approached the American lines under a white flag. They carried an ultimatum from General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps, demanding Bastogn's immediate surrender. The message warned of annihilation if the Americans continued their resistance, promising honorable treatment for prisoners who laid down their arms. McAuliffe's response entered military legend with a single word: nuts. When the German emissaries claimed not to understand the American slang, Colonel Joseph Harper, the division's operations officer, provided a more diplomatic translation: tell them to go to hell. The Germans departed, shaking their heads at American stubbornness, unaware that they had just witnessed the moment when Hitler's last offensive began its transformation from breakthrough to disaster. As the siege tightened around Bastogne, both sides understood that the fate of the entire Ardennes offensive might well be decided in the defense of one small Belgian town. The paratroopers prepared for the assault they knew must come, while German commanders debated whether to continue their advance or concentrate everything against the stubborn American garrison that refused to die. 400 miles to the south, General George Smith Patton Jr. paced the war room of his 3rd Army headquarters like a caged predator. The man whom German intelligence rated as the Allies' most dangerous field commander had spent months battering German defenses along the Siegfried Line, his armored spearheads grinding forward through mud and mines toward the Rhine. Now, with the German breakthrough in the Ardennes threatening to unhinge the entire Allied position, Patton saw opportunity gleaming like sunlight on tank steel. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight David Eisenhower summoned his key lieutenants to an emergency conference in Verdun on December 19th, the same city where French and German armies had bled each other white in the Great War, now witnessed another moment of crisis. As intelligence officers briefed the assembled generals on the scope of the German offensive, most faces reflected concern bordering on alarm. Patton alone seemed energized by the challenge. Hell, let's have the guts to let the bastards go all the way to Paris, Patton declared, his pearl-handled revolvers glinting in the lamplight. Then we'll really cut them off and chew them up. While other commanders spoke of strategic withdrawals and defensive positions, old blood and guts saw the German offensive as Hitler's gift to the Allied cause, enemy reserves drawn out of their fortifications and committed to a battle of movement where American superiority in tanks, aircraft, and logistics could prove decisive. Eisenhower's request seemed impossible. Could Patton's 3rd Army disengage from its current offensive, wheel 90 degrees to the north, and attack the southern flank of the German salient within 72 hours? Most generals would have requested weeks to plan such a complex maneuver. Patton consulted his watch and promised to attack on December 22nd. His staff officers, long accustomed to their commander's aggressive optimism, had already begun the preliminary planning. The execution of Patton's counterattack demonstrated American military logistics at their finest. 3 entire divisions, the 4th Armored, the 26th Infantry, and the 80th Infantry, disengaged from combat, marched through the night across icy roads, and redeployed along a new axis of advance. Over 133,000 men, with their vehicles, supplies, and equipment, completed one of the war's most complex military movements in conditions that would have challenged peacetime maneuvers. Leading Patton's spearhead was Combat Command B of the 4th Armored Division, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Williams Abrams. The future Army Chief of Staff possessed the same aggressive instincts as his Army commander, combined with a tactical brilliance that made him the perfect instrument for Patton's strategy. Abrams understood that speed, not strength, would determine success in the race to relieve Bastogne. Contemporary reports from war correspondent Ernie Pyle, embedded with Patton's forces, described the 3rd Army's redeployment as the most impressive display of American military efficiency witnessed since the Normandy landings. The German High Command initially dismissed reports of Patton's movement as Allied propaganda. Surely no army could redeploy so quickly in winter conditions, particularly while maintaining offensive operations elsewhere. When Panzer reconnaissance units first encountered American Sherman tanks attacking from the south on December 22nd, German commanders assumed they faced local counterattacks by scattered reserve units. The reality struck home with devastating force. Patton's columns, spearheaded by Abrams' armor, smashed through German defensive positions that had been hastily established to guard the southern flank of the salient. The 4th Armored Division advanced 20 miles in 2 days, leaving burning German vehicles scattered across the snow-covered landscape like funeral pyres. For Hitler's dying rack, inside Bastogne, McAuliffe's paratroopers heard the distant rumble of tank guns growing steadily closer. Radio contact with Patton's forces confirmed what the sound of battle had already suggested. Relief was coming. The question now was whether the Screaming Eagles could hold out long enough for Patton's lightning strike to break through the German ring of steel that surrounded their positions. Christmas Eve, 1944, brought no peace to the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes. Inside Bastogne's shrinking perimeter, American paratroopers crouched in frozen foxholes while German artillery shells exploded overhead. Like deadly fireworks, the siege had entered its 6th day, and ammunition, medical supplies, and food had dwindled to critical levels. Yet the men of the 101st Airborne Division held their positions with the grim determination that had made them legends from Normandy to Holland. General von Luttwitz, commanding the German forces besieging Bastogne, prepared for what he hoped would be the final assault. His 47th Panzer Corps had been reinforced with elements of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division and additional artillery batteries. The German commander knew that time was running short. Patton's advance from the south grew stronger each day, and German fuel supplies were nearly exhausted. If Bastogne did not fall within 48 hours, the entire southern wing of Hitler's offensive might collapse. The defenders faced challenges that tested human endurance beyond its limits. Sub-zero temperatures froze weapons mechanisms, making rifles jam at critical moments. Medical corpsmen treated frostbite casualties in aid stations that lacked heat, light, and adequate supplies. The wounded lay on stretchers in unheated buildings, their blood freezing before medics could stanch their wounds. Yet morale remained surprisingly high among troops who had never retreated from any battlefield. Captain John McKnight of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment watched German Tiger tanks rumble through the pre-dawn darkness toward his sector. The massive machines, weighing 5 to 7 tons each, represented the pinnacle of German armored technology. Their thick armor could shrug off direct hits from American anti-tank guns, while their 88mm main guns could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2 miles. McKnight's men possessed only bazookas, mines, and raw courage to stop the approaching behemoths. The Christmas morning assault struck the American perimeter at multiple points simultaneously. German infantry, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns, pushed forward through the snow-laden pine forests. The sound of battle machine gun chatter, tank cannon fire, and the distinctive crack of German assault rifles echoed across the frozen landscape like thunder in a winter storm. Staff Sergeant Robert Nyland of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment led his squad in a desperate defense of a road junction that controlled access to Bastogne Center. When German Panzer Grenadiers overran his position, Nyland and 3 surviving paratroopers fell back to a damaged farmhouse and continued fighting from the rubble for 6 hours. This handful of Americans held off an entire German company, buying precious time for reinforcements to arrive. Military historian Charles MacDonald, who participated in the battle as a company commander, later wrote in A Time for Trumpets that individual acts of heroism during the Bastogne siege exceeded anything witnessed in previous campaigns. The German attack achieved several local breakthroughs, with panzer units actually entering Bastogne's outskirts before American reserves could seal the gaps for 2 critical hours. The fate of the entire garrison hung in the balance, as German tank commanders radioed their superiors that they could see the town's church spires through their periscopes. Victory seemed within grasp, requiring only one final push to collapse the American defense entirely. But the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne possessed something their enemies could not quantify: an absolute refusal to acknowledge defeat. Small groups of Americans, cut off from their units and surrounded by German forces, continued fighting from cellars, attics, and ruins. Medics treated wounded soldiers while under fire. Supply sergeants distributed ammunition during artillery barrages, and radio operators maintained communications despite equipment failures. And enemy jamming attempts died as Christmas Day ended. Both sides counted their losses and prepared for what everyone understood would be the decisive phase of the siege. German commanders had committed their last reserves to the assault on Bastogne, while the American defenders had exhausted their ammunition and medical supplies. Patton's relief column was still miles away, fighting through determined German resistance. The question now was whether Hitler's last gamble would succeed in the ruins of one small Belgian town, or whether American stubbornness would prove stronger than German steel. December 26, 1944, dawned clear and bitter cold across the Ardennes, the first day in 10 that had not brought snow or fog. For the besieged defenders of Bastogne, the crystalline sky offered both hope and terror. Hope because Allied aircraft could finally take to the air. Terror because German artillery observers could now direct their fire with deadly precision. Lieutenant and Colonel Steve Chapuis, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, watched through his binoculars as German forces massed for what appeared to be the final assault. Tigers and Panthers, supported by assault guns and half-tracks loaded with infantry, formed up in the tree line barely 800 yards from his positions. Behind them, he could see the muzzle flashes of German artillery pieces that had been hammering his men for 7 days without respite. The air battle that raged overhead provided a stark illustration of how dramatically the war had shifted since. Hitler's armies had swept across Europe in 1940 and 41. American P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs dominated the skies, their presence made possible by the clear weather that had finally arrived. German pilots, flying aircraft fueled with synthetic gasoline and manned by teenagers with minimal training, could offer little resistance to the Allied aerial armada. From his command post in a battered cellar, General McAuliffe coordinated the defense with characteristic calm. The acting division commander had earned his men's respect not through dramatic speeches or heroic posturing, but through his steady competence under impossible conditions. When German shells crashed into buildings above his headquarters, McAuliffe continued studying his maps and issuing orders as if he were conducting a peacetime exercise. The German assault began at 0900 hours with an artillery barrage that exceeded anything the Americans had yet experienced. For 30 minutes, high explosive shells rained down on Bastogne's defenders with methodical precision. Buildings collapsed, foxholes caved in, and communication lines were severed. When the barrage lifted, German infantry emerged from the forest like gray phantoms, their hobnailed boots crunching through the snow as they advanced toward the American positions. Private First Class Richard Winters of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment found himself isolated with 2 other paratroopers when German forces overran his company's positions, armed with only rifles and a few grenades. The 3 Americans took cover in a bomb crater and prepared to sell their lives dearly. For the next 4 hours, they held off repeated German attacks, proving that individual courage could sometimes triumph over overwhelming odds. The breakthrough came not through German strength, but through American ingenuity. Captain William Dwight of the 420th Field Artillery Battalion had carefully pre-registered his guns on likely German assembly areas. When enemy forces massed for their final push, Dwight's howitzers unleashed a devastating barrage that shattered the attack before it could develop momentum. German casualties were so severe that surviving officers called off the assault and withdrew to defensive positions. According to the post-war interrogation reports compiled by the U.S. Army's Historical Division, German commanders at Bastogne later admitted that American artillery accuracy exceeded anything they had encountered on either the eastern or western fronts. But the most significant development occurred 10 miles to the south, where Lieutenant Colonel Abrams' Combat Command B finally broke through the German defensive line that had blocked Patton's advance for 4 days. The 4th Armored Division's Shermans, supported by firebombers and artillery, overwhelmed the exhausted German defenders and began the final dash toward Bastogne's perimeter. At 1650 hours on December 26th, lead elements of the 37th Tank Battalion made contact with paratroopers of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion. The siege of Bastogne was broken as Abrams tanks rolled through the town streets. Crowds of soldiers emerged from cellars and foxholes to cheer their deliverers. Men who had not seen friendly faces outside their own units for 8 days wept openly as the relief column distributed ammunition, medical supplies, and hot food. The breaking of Bastogne siege marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's Ardennes offensive. German forces that might have continued their advance toward the Meuse were now forced to defend. Against Patton's expanding salient, the initiative had passed permanently to the Americans, and the Third Reich's last strategic reserve was trapped in a bulge of its own making, facing destruction from 3 sides. The new year of 1945 found German forces in the Ardennes, trapped in an ever-tightening noose of American steel. What Hitler had envisioned as a lightning thrust to Antwerp had become a costly salient that bled the Wehrmacht's remaining strength into the frozen forests of Belgium. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the architect of Germany's early victories, watched helplessly as his armies faced the same fate that had befallen Napoleon's Grande Army in Russia: destruction through overextension and insufficient supplies. General Eisenhower, meeting with his commanders at his headquarters in Versailles, authorized the counteroffensive that would eliminate the German salient entirely. The Supreme Allied commander had weathered the initial shock of Hitler's surprise attack and now possessed overwhelming superiority in men, tanks, aircraft, and artillery. 3 American armies, the 1st, 3rd, and 9th, would converge on the trapped German forces from north, south, and west, while the Royal Air Force and United States Army Air Forces maintained constant pressure from above. The German withdrawal began on January 8, 1945, as Hitler finally acknowledged that his last gamble had failed. Model's Army Group B, which had spearheaded the offensive with such dramatic success 3 weeks earlier, now faced the prospect of fighting its way back to the Siegfried Line while under constant attack. Fuel shortages forced German commanders to abandon hundreds of tanks and vehicles, creating a trail of destruction that stretched across the Ardennes. Like a monument to Nazi ambitions, Joachim Peiper, whose Kampfgruppe had achieved the deepest penetration into American territory, found himself commanding a force that existed only on paper. His SS Panzer Regiment had lost 60% of its tanks, most abandoned when their fuel ran out rather than destroyed in combat. The officer, who had begun the offensive dreaming of glory, now focused solely on extricating his surviving men from the trap that Hitler's strategy had created. The human cost of the Ardennes offensive staggered both sides. American casualties totaled 81,000 men, including 19,000 killed in action, the heaviest losses sustained by U.S. forces in any single battle of the European War. German losses were even more severe: 120,000 casualties, including 26,000 killed and many of the Wehrmacht's most experienced officers and non-commissioned officers. For an army already stretched to its breaking point, such losses represented a catastrophe from which recovery was impossible. The strategic consequences extended far beyond casualty figures. Hitler's offensive had consumed Germany's last mobile reserves, leaving the Eastern Front catastrophically weakened just as the Red Army prepared its final assault on the Reich. The fuel expended in the Ardennes could have sustained defensive operations for months. Instead, it had been squandered in 3 weeks of fuel attacks. Most critically, the offensive had destroyed whatever remained of German morale, proving to soldiers and civilians alike that their leadership possessed neither the resources nor the competence to change the war's outcome. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that the Battle of the Bulge accelerated Germany's collapse by approximately 6 months, effectively ending any possibility of prolonged resistance in Western Europe. American forces, meanwhile, emerged from the battle with enhanced confidence and improved tactical effectiveness. Units that had been shattered in the initial German assault were rebuilt stronger than before, while the successful defense of Bastogne became a symbol of American determination that inspired soldiers throughout the European theater. The integration of replacement personnel proceeded more smoothly than in previous campaigns, creating a more experienced and resilient army. By January 28, 1945, the Bulge had been eliminated entirely. American forces stood once again along the German border, but now they faced an enemy whose strategic reserves had been expended in a desperate gamble that had failed completely. The Rhine River, Germany's last natural barrier, lay just beyond the horizon, defended by forces that possessed neither the strength nor the will to resist much longer. Hitler's dream of splitting the Western Allies and forcing a negotiated peace had died in the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes. The Third Reich had 6 months remaining, but its fate had been sealed not by superior Allied strategy or overwhelming material advantage, but by one Austrian corporal's inability to accept the reality of Germany's strategic situation. The Battle of the Bulge had been Hitler's last stand, and like so many of his strategic decisions, it had hastened rather than delayed the doom he sought to avoid. The veterans of Bastogne and the Ardennes would carry their memories of that bitter winter for the rest of their lives. But they had witnessed something more significant than a military victory. They had seen the moment when Nazi Germany's capacity for strategic surprise died forever in the frozen forests of Belgium.